take you through how you can find or solve a system of equation using inverse approach, that S equal to A inverse B. So we have been given a word problem which you're going to read it out, and then we find our equations and cast it to matrix form, and we use the inverse approach to solve. Now it says that Stonewall receives 250 cedis per year in simple interest from an amount of money he invested in ADB, Barclays, and GCB. Suppose ADB pays an interest of 2%, Barclays pays an interest of 4%, and GCB pays an interest of 5% per annum, and an amount of 350 cedis more was invested in Barclays than the amount invested in ADB and GCB combined, and also the amount invested in Barclays is 2 times the amount invested in GCB. The first question says we should write down the linear equations and cast them into matrix form, that is in the form AS equal to B. And the second thing we are supposed to do is to find the amount of money that we have invested in all these banks, that's ADB, Barclays, and GCB. So I just try to write out what is in the word equation so that it can make sense to us. Now he said that he received 250 as interest that he on all the amount that invested in the various banks. So it tells us that in totality the interest that he received on all the amount that he invested was what? 250. So when you put the interest that I received on amount invested in ADB, the amount that I invested in GCB, the amount I invested in Barclays, when you put all the interest together, it should give you 250. So that's why I wrote total interest equal to 250. And then the various rates, the interest rates are the ones I've represented. So for ADB you have 2%, for Barclays you have 4%, and then for GCB we have 5%. So when you change it to decimal, you're going to have 0.02, you're going to have 0.04, you are going to have 0.05. And it went on to tell us that 350 more was invested in Barclays than ADB and GCB combined. So when you put the amount that he invested in ADB and GCB, when you put them together, you have to add 350 to it in order to get the amount that he invested in Barclays. The last one says that the amount he invested in Barclays is 2 times the amount that he invested in GCB. Okay, so I will let S represent amount invested in ADB. Then let Y equal to amount invested in Barclays. And then let Z represent amount invested in GCB. So with this, we now know the variable, so we can use whatever they have given to us to find our equations. We also know that simple interest, the formula is I equal to PRT, where I is the interest, R is the principal, R is the interest rate, and then T is the time period. From our question, they said per annum, so the time is 1, the rate is for each of the banks, and the principal amount, we know that the amount invested in ADB is X, the amount invested in Barclays is Y, and the amount invested in GCB is Z. So the first thing we need to do is to find the simple interest for all the banks. And then when you put them together, it's supposed to be equal to the 250 which we said earlier. So when you do that, then you get one equation, then you move on to the next one. So for interest for ADB, we know that the principal is X, and you are multiplying it by the interest rate, which is 0.02, and then the time period is 1. So when you do this well, you're going to get 0.02x. Then you come to interest for Barclays. Now the amount that is invested is Y, and then the interest rate is 0.04, and then the period is 1, so it's still going to get 0.04y. Then interest rate for GCB, is given by z multiplied by the interest rate is 5, and then the time period is still 1. So we're going to have 0.05 z. Okay, so you have found the interest that is paid on each of the amount he has paid in all the banks. So you put them together, you're going to have 0.02x plus 0.04y plus 0.05z. And this should be equal to the total interest that he got, because the interest that he got from ADB plus the interest that he got from Barclays plus the interest that I got from GCB should be equal to the total interest. So this can be equation 1. Now the next equation, how do you find the next equation? Now we also know that they said that 350 cedis was invested more in what? Barclays than the rest of the banks combined. So when you add the amount that is invested in ADB and GCB, and you add 350 to it, you are going to get the amount that you invested in Barclays. But we know that the amount that you invested in Barclays is y. So it should be equal to 350 plus, when you add the amount that you invested in ADB, which is x, and then the amount that you invested in GCB, which is z, it should, and you add 350 to it, you're supposed to get y. So what I need to do is that I'm going to bring everything to the left hand side. So I'm going to have minus x plus y plus or minus z equal to 350, and this will be equation 2. So this is my equation 1. And the last equation says that the amount that you invested in Barclays is 2 times the amount that you invested in GCB. So that one, he said the amount that I invested in Barclays is y, and then the amount that you invested in GCB is z. So it is 2 times the amount that I invested in GCB. So when I bring this to the left hand, I'm going to have y minus 2z equal to 0, and this is equation 3. So we've gotten 3 equations. We can now cast it to matrix form and solve. So we have been able to derive some equations from these 3 equations. So it's simple for us to cast it to matrix form and solve. Remember that if you want to cast any equation at all into matrix form, the arrangement in all the equations should be the same. If the first variable is in the first equation, should be the first variable in the second equation, and that follows suit in the third equation on the number of equations that you are dealing with. So my s here is s here, and since there is no s here, it's assumed that we have 0x. Then when you come, the next one is y here. So we have y here, and we also have y here. Then we have z, and z here. And then all my constants are the right hand side. So now I want to cast it to matrix form. So what I need to do is that I can pick the first equation. So my first equation, all the coefficients of the variables here becomes my first row. All the coefficients of the variables in the second equation becomes my second row. And all the coefficients of the variables in the third equation becomes my third row. So I'll do that. So in the first equation, the first coefficient of x here is 0.02. So it becomes my first element here. Then the next one is 0.04. Then the next one is 0.05. Then I'll come to the second equation. So we are dealing with the left hand side here. So I'll come to the second. The first coefficient is minus 1. The coefficient is 1, and this one is minus 1. Then since we don't have any s variable here, the coefficient will be 0 because it's assumed that it's 0x. Anything you multiply by 0 is obviously 0. So we're going to have the coefficient of y here is 1, the coefficient of z here is minus 2. Then you form your equation, and this is what we call the coefficient matrix, and you have the column vector of the variables that you are dealing with equal to the right hand side. You write all the constants. You have 250 in that order. You have 350, and you have 0. Now, what you need to understand is that with regards to this, when you re-multiply this, you are supposed to get back your equation. So if you cast any equation at all into a matrix form and you multiply back, you are not able to get that same equation, then it means that there is something wrong with your equation or how you cast it to matrix form. So the next thing to do is to solve this using the inverse approach. Remember that this matrix is matrix A, which is the coefficient matrix. You have a column vector, which is X, and then we have our column vector, which is also called a constant matrix, as B.